Kevin Harvick spent 22 seasons in NASCAR's Cup Series, and in that time, he accumulated 60 wins, one championship, and a record of off-track confrontations that has few comparisons in the modern era of the sport. He climbed across the roof of a rival's car on pit road. He absorbed a $35,000 fine for climbing onto a competitor's door panel after a race. At Darlington in 2011, he sprinted across pit road and attempted to strike a driver through an open car window. Through most of it, photographs show him smiling. His nickname was Happy. The name was earned in the garage, in the paddock, in sponsor meetings, in the press room. On the racetrack, what it concealed was something considerably more combustible. This is an account of the major rivalries of Kevin Harvick's career. What happened, what was at stake, and what those confrontations say about one of the most competitive figures in recent NASCAR history. Kevin Harvick was born in Bakersfield, California in 1975. He came up through the late model circuit on the West Coast through the mid-1990s. Regional racing, modest budgets, and tracks where the margins between drivers were thin and the competition personal. Several of the men he would later clash with in NASCAR's National Series were on those same circuits. He reached Richard Childress Racing's Cup program in 2001 under circumstances that were, to put it plainly, extraordinary. Dale Earnhardt had died at Daytona in February. The team needed a driver. Harvick, 25 years old, largely unknown outside of the Busch series, was given the car. He won in his third Cup start. That early chapter established certain things about the way Harvick operated. He was competitive at a level his experience didn't yet warrant, and he knew it. He drove with an intensity that did not distinguish between senior veterans and first-year drivers. What someone had accomplished before they arrived at the track was largely irrelevant to how he raced them once they were there. His public persona, the humor, the self-deprecation, the ease with reporters, was real. But it existed alongside something harder. He kept track of what happened on the racetrack, and he responded to it. That pattern repeated itself in varying forms throughout his career. The first confrontation that received widespread attention came in the 2002 Xfinity Series season at Bristol Motor Speedway. Harvick and Greg Biffle had history going back to the late model circuit in the mid-1990s, and by the time they were both in NASCAR's National Series, the relationship was already strained. At Bristol, with 9 laps remaining in a 250-lap race, Biffle made contact with Harvick's car and sent it hard into the outside wall. Harvick was done for the night. Rather than return to his garage, he climbed a pit box and waited. He later said in an interview on his podcast that he had no specific plan at that point. He knew he was going to do something. When Biffle pulled onto pit road after finishing the race, Harvick moved up and over the rear deck of Biffle's car and grabbed him by the collar. It took Biffle's jackman, a large man by Harvick's own description, to pull him away. Both drivers were fined. Both had points docked. Harvick later confirmed that he personally covered every penalty. Team owner Richard Childress made certain of that. What Biffle said publicly afterward, in subsequent interviews, added a layer of context that didn't surface at the time. He indicated he had deliberately restrained himself, calculating that retaliation wasn't worth the financial and points consequences. Given the opportunity without those constraints, he said, he would have responded more directly. The two clashed again at Chicagoland in 2005 and at Martinsville in 2011. The relationship was never easy. In later years, Harvick described Biffle as one of the hardest drivers he ever had to beat, someone who gave nothing away on the racetrack and earned whatever he got. In December 2025, Biffle died in a plane crash in North Carolina while conducting helicopter operations in support of Hurricane Helene flood relief. In a tribute on his podcast, Harvick described him as an intense competitor, and, he said, a better human being off the track than most people knew. In the fall of 2003 at Richmond International Raceway, Harvick was involved in an incident with Ricky Rudd, a driver then in his 26th Cup season. With 4 laps remaining, Rudd made contact with Harvick's car from behind, advancing his own position and dropping Harvick to a 16th place finish. After the race, Harvick pulled alongside Rudd's car, climbed up on the door, and confronted him at close range while both men were still in their vehicles. The penalties were substantial. 7 people associated with Harvick were fined. Such 2 crew members were suspended. Harvick's personal fine came to $35,000, and Childress again ensured he paid it himself. Rudd's response, offered to reporters, was dismissive. He suggested Harvick talked more than was warranted given his standing in the sport. Harvick's position was straightforward. He didn't recognize the premise. In his view, how long someone had been in NASCAR had no bearing on how he raced them, or on what they were owed in a confrontation after the race. Seniority was not a factor he considered relevant. The incident at Richmond and his public response to it made that position clear to everyone watching. The rivalry between Kevin Harvick and Kyle Busch is, by most measures, the most sustained and consequential of Harvick's career. It ran for the better part of a decade, crossed multiple NASCAR series, involved their respective ownership organizations, and produced several of the most widely covered incidents in the sport's recent history. The foundation was laid early. Busch has described a crash in the Xfinity Series at Darlington, in which the two cars became interlocked on the front stretch as the moment the dynamic between them was established. Mike Joy, calling the race from the broadcast booth, noted that the wreck was still developing long after initial contact. The bad feeling between the two men developed at a similar pace. By 2010, the conflict had escalated into something more deliberate. At Homestead, in the final race of the season, Harvick made contact with Busch's car from behind and drove him into the inside wall. Most observers read it as intentional. Busch had no doubt. The following year produced what is probably the most documented sequence of events between the two. At Darlington in September 2011 during the Southern 500, repeated contact between Harvick and Busch in the closing laps ultimately resulted in Busch turning Harvick into the wall. Clint Bowyer, who was racing nearby, was also collected in the incident. After the race concluded, Busch returned on track and used his car to push Harvick's stationary vehicle into the outside wall. Harvick, out of his car by this point, moved toward Busch's vehicle and attempted to reach through the window. Busch drove away and used his car in doing so to strike Harvick's empty vehicle a second time. Harvick acknowledged afterward that his shoulder was sore from a punch that connected with nothing. Both drivers were fined $25,000. They both were placed on probation. Their respective team owners, Richard Childress and Joe Gibbs, were called into a meeting with NASCAR. Harvick later described that conversation as among the more intense of his career. Joe Gibbs, he said, sent him a personal letter afterward. 6 weeks later, at Texas Motor Speedway, the conflict extended to a connected party. In the Camping World Truck Series race, Busch made contact with Ron Hornaday Jr., a four-time Truck Series champion who drove for Harvick's truck team, under caution, in a move that effectively ended Hornaday's championship campaign. Harvick's radio communication from that race was direct and unambiguous. Busch was going to answer for it. NASCAR responded by parking Busch for the full Cup Series weekend at Texas, one of the more significant penalties the sanctioning body had issued in recent memory. The rivalry eventually settled into something different. Both men went on to win Cup championships, Harvick in 2014, Busch in 2015, and 2019. In a later interview, Harvick summarized it concisely. They both wanted to cause each other serious physical harm at the time. By the time he said it, he was laughing. The distance of years had converted something genuinely hostile into something that could be spoken about plainly. Their sons, Keelan Harvick and Brexton Busch, are now competing in youth racing. By late 2013, Harvick had informed Richard Childress Racing that he would not be returning for the 2014 season. He had spent his entire Cup career at that organization. The departure was professionally managed. The emotional dimension was more complicated. At Martinsville, in a Truck Series race that fall, Harvick came into conflict with Ty Dillon, a grandson of Richard Childress, over racing conduct on the track. Harvick's response was to park his truck in Dillon's pit stall, blocking him from entering. A member of the Dillon crew threw a tool, specifically a hammer, at Harvick's truck. In the media availability that followed, Harvick explained his departure from the organization in terms of the Dillon situation. He said that watching drivers who had been given every resource without having to earn them was a fundamental problem, and that it was one of the primary reasons he was leaving. The statement left no ambiguity. It also left no bridge intact. Harvick signed with Stewart-Haas Racing and competed for them beginning in 2014. That season, he won the NASCAR Cup Series championship. The final significant rivalry of Harvick's Cup career emerged in 2021 during the NASCAR playoffs at Bristol Motor Speedway. In character, it was different from what had come before, less prolonged and more concentrated in a single exchange. Chase Elliott was the defending Cup champion at the time and one of the most popular drivers in the sport. During the Bristol playoff race, contact between his car and Harvick's affected Elliott's result. On pit road afterward, the two spoke. Elliott's remarks were measured and pointed. He indicated that Harvick's standing as a veteran carried no weight with him in that situation. As the exchange concluded, he expressed, with deliberate politeness, his hope that Harvick would enjoy the offseason. Both drivers' camps had merchandise based on the exchange in circulation within days. NASCAR moved to contain the situation before it could affect the integrity of the playoff format. What the confrontation illustrated, beyond its immediate details, was a particular kind of transition point. Harvick was in the latter portion of a long career. Elliott was at the beginning of what appeared to be a dominant one, a driver who had decided clearly and publicly that reputation alone would not determine how he responded to anyone on the racetrack. The dynamic was not unlike the position Harvick himself had occupied 2 decades earlier. Over the course of 22 Cup seasons, Kevin Harvick was involved in significant on-track or post-race conflicts with a substantial number of his peers. Biffle, Rudd, Kyle Busch, the Dillons, Joey Logano, Brad Keselowski, and Chase Elliott, among others. The pattern was consistent enough to be considered a characteristic rather than a series of isolated incidents. What the record also shows is that most of these conflicts eventually reached a form of resolution, not through formal reconciliation, but through the accumulated respect that tends to develop between people who have competed against each other seriously over many years. Harvick was not indifferent to the quality of his opponents. He took note of it. He acknowledged, near the end of his driving career, that the confrontational dimension of his public persona had an element of performance to it, that NASCAR operates as both a sport and an entertainment product, and that he was aware of what he contributed to both. He retired following the 2023 season with 60 Cup victories, 1 championship, and 121 combined wins across NASCAR's 3 National Series, a total that places him 3rd on the all-time list. He now works as a race analyst for Fox Sports. Which of Harvick's rivalries do you consider the most significant? Leave your view in the comments. If you follow NASCAR history and want more coverage of the sport's defining personalities and events, subscribe and turn on notifications. New content publishes every week.